Now in the next session, it is about the new order of tourism destinations. And in the beginning of each session, we are having a voting opportunity for you. We want to have a mood picture of to a question, which is then helping the speakers and the moderator to maybe adjust their talk a little bit. We are taking a repetition of a question which was already in the session before, and I won't give you the answer quite yet. It's your time to answer. Here is the question. In times of a tightening security situation, are you going to travel abroad less? You have all this little remote control on your seat. We're having very loud there in the background. The little remote control, and if you press the button 1, 2, or 3, we are getting an answer when the music goes on, right? No? Okay. Yes, I will spend more of my holidays in my home country. No, I'll continue to travel abroad, but I look very closely where I'm going. Similar situation like we had in the session before. There the percentage was 72.6 for the middle answer, and somehow it seems logic to me. However, we will discuss or have a panel discussion here led by Eike Otto. Is Mr. Otto here? Yes, welcome. Eike Otto is working since 1991 as independent tourism consultant in Germany and abroad, and both for private and public clients. His main topic is sustainable tourism. Current project references range from the cruise industry and the hotel sector to projects of international cooperation. And as we learned in the session before, cooperation, coordination between stakeholders is what makes all the cybersecurity and technology actually work. Today, Eike is working as a moderator, consultant, and trainer in tourism, and he can look back on the experiences of over 100 projects, basically all over the world. The stage is yours and your fantastic speakers. Thank you.
Ja, meine Damen und Herren, ich gebe...
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to give a brief introduction into our topic before I ask the panelists to come on stage. I hope it's okay that I speak in German and you all get an English translation. It's about the reorganization of tourism destinations, and we had already discussed this in previous occasions. Tourism depends greatly on the international security situation, more than any other industries. You might be able to sell cars or cell phones everywhere where the situation might not be so secure, but attacks and insecurity or security problems have an impact on destinations. People might not go to Africa or Islamic countries, or Asian people might not travel to Europe. We've all seen that. I was recently in Portugal, and there are some positive growth rates, so there are winners in the context. So my first theory, there are losers and winners among the destinations. And there's another phenomenon as well. 20 years ago, there were the first attacks, for example, in Egypt and in the temples there, and then visitor figures recovered relatively quickly. Egypt, Tunisia, and Turkey now have a longer impact regarding the security issues. So although the situation might then be better, it takes a longer time for these destinations to recover. And Tunisia is a very good example for that. Yesterday, the results of Travel Zoo were presented, and it's interesting that also Turkey is relatively high on the fear list among German tourists, and we were surprised to see that there were, before Egypt and Tunisia, the United States are also interesting in this context. So instability and insecurity are on the same level, basically, in these countries. And my theory number 2 is that the actual danger is not the problem, but the unpredictability and the fear of the unknown situation. Now the tourism industry has to face up to these challenges and has to try to deal with these threats. We heard that already yesterday, and today we have a very highly renowned panel. Ms. Nordberg from GfK Travel Logistics is our first panelist. I asked her to take her seat. She deals with consumer behavior and flows of tourism. Then Peter Mario Kupsch from Studiosausweisen in Munich is our next panelist. Mr. Kupsch is not only an expert in study tours, but also in communications and travel communications. Then Mr. Schiller from FDI. You are the fourth largest travel organizer in Europe with 4 to 5 million tourists each year. And then we have somebody from a country that is affected, Mr. Hüseyin Baraner, from Turkey. He's responsible for tourism at TÜRSAB, the Turkish Travel Association. They have 9,400 member agencies. That is quite a large number. And last but not least, we have a marketing and PR expert, Mr. Harald Zulauf. He's a CEO of Media Consulta, the largest European privately owned tourism company. And I'm happy that we also have a communications expert here who can also comment on these issues. Now, Ms. Nordbeck, could you give us a brief introduction? Last year you also did that. Give us the recent findings regarding safety, security, and visitor flows. Can you give us a brief input, and then we can start our panel discussion. Yes, of course, I'm delighted to do so. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and good morning. I would like to briefly sketch what the role of safety and security is in the German tourism market. Every year at GfK, we ask about the most important values for tourists. And as you can see here, security has increasing importance and is a high priority with 83% and even more than last year. So much for this introduction. Now, what does that mean for us? Last year, unfortunately, the number of attacks already increased, and we were able to observe how Germans changed their travel behavior. What we saw was Germans continue to travel. The number of people who don't travel has not increased. That's the positive news. The number of trips has not changed either. There was even an increase by 2%, but travel behavior has changed. People travel differently. For example, city trips have decreased in demand. There is an increasing trend towards traveling in Germany or with your own car or to the Caribbean, Spain or Greece, or cruise travels. Cruises have increased in popularity. And thus, also, the booking behavior has changed. People have tried new direct booking options and actually organize their own trips. So much for last year. But what is the situation this year? What about 2017 and the summer of 2017? Germans make their bookings relatively early. In January, we already had 43% of bookings for this year. In the classic travel agency business, there's a recovery of 6% over the previous year in agency bookings, and online it's even better. But last year there was a decline by 9% over the previous year, and we haven't quite recovered from that yet. Now, if we look at the destinations, then we see that the Western Mediterranean, and you might be surprised, there is even a decline by 1%, but Spain and Portugal had a boom year last year. So we're comparing to a relatively high level. The Eastern Mediterranean, this might also be surprising, has a positive increase of 7%. The destinations here are not necessarily Turkey, but there is a number of other destinations that are important. Turkey has a decline. Greece has a boom, has experienced a tripling of their usual figures, for example, 3 years ago. Egypt has a plus, but also Bulgaria and Croatia have experienced an increase in bookings, and Morocco and smaller destinations as Cyprus as well. And of course, cruises are in high demand, and they have double-digit growth rates. So much for my input. I think I do not want to anticipate the discussion. The discussion will be interesting, and I will have an opportunity to add a couple of more figures in the course of the discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Nordbeck. Maybe I could ask a follow-up question. What is the share of people who no longer travel? Have you been able to measure that as well? Or is that only a shift of destinations? Well, there's practically nobody who refuses to travel. There are always people who don't travel for financial reasons, for example. But the number of these people has not increased. But people change their travel and booking behavior. We saw it already in the figures. They choose different destinations. They choose different modes of traveling. They might book more spontaneously. They change their behavior, but they don't refuse to travel. You talk about the German-speaking or the German market? The German market. Mr. Schiller, can you confirm that? What has been your experience as one of the large players here with respect to travel business? What Ms. Nordbeck just said is also reflected in our figures. Last year, around this time, January, February, families usually book, and because of the attacks, particularly in Paris in 2015, but also in Brussels, and some of the unfortunate incidents that happened in the beginning of last year, created insecurity among this group. So there was a certain destination shift, and Ms. Nordbeck already explained that, but it also created a situation where insecurity motivated some customers to no longer fly just because they did not want to make a long-term decision. They rather wanted to take their own car and, for example, go to Austria. And security and safety are subjective perceptions, of course. The attacks actually happened in Western countries, but this created an insecurity among our customers. What have your experiences been in so far? When is there a recovery? Nobody really understands the phenomenon of Turkey. Well, you could understand it, but why is Turkey the main loser in this context? Will there be a recovery, or will the slump continue? Well, frankly, I cannot confirm what you just said. Of course, Turkey is in the focus at the moment, but it's not so much a security discussion, it's more a political discussion. And that is similar to other destinations where people tend to be more aggressive at the moment. And in the past, also last year, whenever there were incidents, Turkey was able to return to normalcy relatively quickly. And I said it frequently last year, particularly in Germany. The source markets might look differently. Trust returned relatively quickly regarding this destination. So obviously, Germans feel much closer to Turkey than we tend to perceive. And we have to see how things develop. For our company, we can say that we don't have this massive decline as we've seen it in the market in general. And last year we didn't have that either. But it's also a question of how to deal with a destination, whether you still believe in the destination. And it is relatively irresponsible to make statements like we heard them recently. We, as organizers, leave it up to our customers to decide. And if they decide to travel to Turkey, we will not try to convince them to change their minds if it is in line with security considerations. Now, we also have a representative of the Turkish tourism industry here. People always talk about diverse figures in Turkey. People are talking about records. In Germany, it looks quite differently. So what is the actual situation? Well, I cannot tell you what the golden average is. I can only tell you what I know. I've been in this business for 40 years, and I've been actively focusing on German-Turkish tourism relations. At the moment, Turkey is a destination where tourists from 80 countries come, from Mongolia to Myanmar. We have charter planes coming to Antalya and other destinations, or for example, Bodrum. So my fellow countrymen, they have succeeded in placing and positioning Turkey as a destination everywhere in the world, and we benefit from that. Germany is a very important country for us too. Turkish people have a very emotional relationship with Germany. All other countries are not in that category. When Turks talk about Germany and discuss it, there will be very emotional discussions, and people want to give their opinions because we have realized a lot of business with German tourism operators. Studiosos was the most important company in the beginning of the 1980s, and they actually taught us how to deal with tourists. Dear colleagues, we have problems. 2016, but also 2017 have been difficult years for the Turkish tourism industry. We now asking questions we didn't ask in the past. Turkey is in a politically but also strategically difficult situation at the moment. And also our entire environment is in a difficult situation. So the happy years, the happy post-war years, where we all were naive, are over, particularly in our region. We have Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Russia as our neighboring countries. Then to the east we have Iran, then we have Iraq, where unfortunately for 20 years now, more than 4 million people were killed directly near our borders. Then we all saw what happened to Syria overnight. I worked for a large international tourism operator and visited Syria in 2009 and 2010 and discussed with 5-star hotels. We concluded the contracts. We already wanted to order furniture. And now you see what has happened to that country within the last 6 to 7 years. Millions of people have died. And then on the other side in the Mediterranean, we had these beautiful cruise ships with all-inclusive, from Koba beef to salsa from Guatemala. And on the other side, or on the shores of the countries, there were people who haven't eaten for weeks. And when I visited ITB during these years, it was always a happy time. It was always nice. We never had any problems. Everything was great for the experts and for the visitors at ITB. It was a wonderful event, but now the world has problems and Turkey has even more problems. But I come back to your question now. Turkey is undergoing considerable changes at the moment. And in recent years, up to 55% of our population have been in favor of making Turkey politically strong, but also with respect to infrastructure, new investment, new jobs, new universities, schools. And my fellow countrymen say for that we need a strong leader. And when everything is over, then we can do the fine-tuning, and then we can have politicians like you had with Willy Brandt. This is the mood at the moment in Turkey, if I may explain it in that fashion. And we in Turkey have great concerns and worries regarding the future of our country. And the press in Germany is sometimes exaggerating. We know that because we live in the country. But then we also think it's great that our friends in Germany comment on the situation. So with our political views, we are in a very ambivalent situation. We haven't found the truth yet. This is the status of today. In 3 months or in 1 year, we might see the situation differently. Well, it's all nice and well what you're saying. Well, I was a tour guide for studiosos in the past, so I can, tell stories. Well, you mentioned the political situation. We do not want to discuss that here today. But what have you been observing? All these different figures. Let's talk about the German source market again. Is tourism in Turkey now rock bottom, or is it recovering again? What is your information? Well, in 2017, we will have fewer guests in our country altogether. No. For example, GFK would have to visit Turkey. There are 80 countries who send tourists to us. The Russian market is our second largest, and we expect an increase of 600% for all hotels at the Turkish Riviera and in Antalya. A 600% increase in Russian tourists. In Georgia, a small country but very important one for Turkey, we expect 1,000% increase. And Ukraine, the small country, sends more than 1 million tourists to Turkey in 2017, an incredibly high number. And I could list a lot of other countries. Our main areas of crisis or countries of crisis where we do not achieve the same figures are Germany and Austria. But I must say that FTI or other organizers who, particularly in the crisis year of 2016, gained the admiration of Turkish people because we thought there wouldn't be any German tourists coming, and all other colleagues and all other competitors in the market had double-digit declines. But FTI, with their many campaigns and good ideas, actually succeeded in a crisis year like 2016 to attract more people to Turkey. Or at least FTI proved to us that with intelligent marketing measures, even a problematic country can attract tourists. Now, a lot of people want to copy FTI, my other partners too, and myself too. If you're visible in the market, if you're active in the market, people will come even in times of crisis. We have a lot of repeat customers in Turkey. And we did some internal research. In the last 40 years, 22 million Germans came to Turkey, and 30% of them are loyal, repeat customers. They know that the Turks have their problems. They say, okay, let them solve their own problems. We will spend our vacation there. And the number of these people is very high too. Well, this is not the press conference of Turkey, but it's interesting what you've been saying, and we might be able to also apply that to other countries. And you also have experiences with Turkey, slightly different experiences from FTI probably. But how do you comment what Mr. Baraner just said about the situation and the visitor figures? Well, I can only report the figures of our company. Unfortunately, these are not as positive as the global demand, which remains stable, obviously. Our figures have considerably declined already last year, and this year no recovery is visible. So we can honestly say that trips to Turkey are almost at the lowest level ever. Now, this is an important time to decide against Turkey as a destination for some people. And maybe we should add another S to our description of the situation: sympathy for Turkey. That would be the third S. So we're not against the Turkish people. Everyone who's ever traveled to Turkey knows that the country is very friendly to tourists, and hospitality in Turkey is remarkable. But now, because of the political situation, there will be problems. It's nice that you hope for a new Willy Brandt in Turkey. I would like to subscribe to that. But I must partially agree with Mr. Schiller. In the past, recoveries were usually relatively quick after attacks, etc. I'm one of the old-timers here, and according to my experience, recoveries are completely different when it comes to attacks that are explicitly directed against tourists and tourism destinations. We saw it in Zurich. People thought in an all-inclusive beach resort you are safe, and it was a shock for tourists that even in a beach resort, in an all-inclusive destination, you're not safe, like everywhere in the world. In Istanbul, there was a terrible attack on a German group of tourists, and then also German guests and German citizens. When they are affected, the shock wave is much more sustained, and it takes much longer before there is a recovery. There was an attack on a Russian plane, mainly hitting tourists, and that is also an event that prolongs the time of recovery. And if the frequency of attacks is relatively high, and you don't have singular events like the attack in 1997 that was mentioned already today, then the impact will be longer in the medium and long term, that is. And customers do not only feel unsafe, they simply do not book this destination, and they rather choose a destination that is more safe. At least they perceive it as a safer destination. Now, we've all experienced that neither a city like Paris, Istanbul, or Berlin or Sousse are safe these days. Well, one must also say that the risk of an attack or to be hit by an attack for tourists is relatively low. Tourist destinations are less affected, like Somalia, for example. So the probability to be hit by lightning is 1.3 times higher than being the victim of an attack against tourists. But I can remember a talk round at Expo 2000, a representative of your company, the PR commissioner, talked about international tourism at the time, and on your website you proactively communicated this issue with your customers. And yesterday you were often quoted in this security talk round. How did you come up with that communication situation? Then wasn't as bad as it is today. What have been your experiences?
Well, security in our type of travel was always a topic. And of course, back then we were talking also about health risks such as criminal activities, whether these were attacks or other phenomena. Well, the whole issue surrounding security, a traveler being affected by tourism attacks, of course, is situated at a much different level. And I think after 9/11, we were almost paralyzed. I remember people who had booked a train travel to Tuscany and who simply step back from traveling. It's completely irrational. It's not something that you can explain. It is a perceived security threat that has a strong influence on decision-making. What can you do about it? Well, I think the only thing you can do is inform people proactively, try to mitigate uncertainties and anxieties by being very transparent, being very proactive in providing information. And starting 9/11, 2001, we were quite stringent in that, where we provided information on high-risk areas. So, beginning, that was a bit off-putting and irritating also for our clients. We would provide at the beginning, for example, the risk assessments of the Federal Foreign Office, and a number of clients were left unsure as to what their feelings were about that. And we had numerous debates also with our colleagues, tour operators, and they would confront us saying, well, you can't do this, you're stirring uncertainty and anxieties here. But I think across a number of years and over the period, we've seen that this is probably the only way to deal with this kind of situation, risk situation, hazardous situations. Our clients have become used to this scenario and have become used to travel having that information, and we're still very proactive about it, knowing, of course, that you will never be able to provide 100% security, and we will never know where the next terror attack is bound to happen. Well, this certainly links back to the survey that we had here in the hall. People wish to continue to travel, but they want to have information about their destinations. And another phenomenon is perhaps that people perhaps wait a bit longer before booking. What do you see? Do you see a change in the pattern there? Well, it has become very, very clearly the case, and in certain destinations, all the more so. Egypt, for example, we saw there was a lot of short-term booking last year, and I think the same applies also to Turkey. That has changed a bit more. We have more long-term booking, so there's been a certain recovery there. They're popping back up on our demand radar screen. Also for the next summer, we have bookings taking place. Turkey is being booked as we speak, rather on a short-term basis. People tend to book when they have the feeling that they have a clear idea or understanding of the security situation, the political situation. As was already mentioned, this is a very subjective, a very individual, intimate perception. It also depends a lot of the individual situation of the client. Am I a family father? Do I have children? Then perhaps certain aspects come more into play than others. Those are elements that we do not control, or that we cannot influence. But we do know that we need to be very flexible on the planning side, because we never know when the next attack or next event can take place. This does not necessarily, by the way, have to be an attack. It could also be a political dispute or a political statement that's put out, or a natural catastrophe that can take place almost everywhere in the world. And I think we've learned a lot. We've learned on the fly in the situation. Communication has become much more important in that sense, in anticipation of anything that can happen. But very often, we're accused, or we stand accused of trying to gloss over things or try to spin things in a positive way, but I don't think that that's any longer the case. And on our website, we do have a huge crisis team that becomes immediately active if an event takes place, that communicates with the clients. We have a clear line also with the tourism agencies. All of that infrastructure has been set up, and this is also an added value that tour operators should be able to provide nowadays. And the other aspect I mentioned is that clients have a vast scope and range of choices nowadays. We need to deal with that. So we have that added value to offer. We have a very intensive communication with the crisis centers, crisis management centers, and federal foreign offices. I think we're much more professional in our setup than was clearly the case just a couple of years ago. And I think that is probably an increasing aspect also of our business model. I think we're now reaching a point where the gentleman sitting to my left will also come in. I'd like to pursue or move over to the second question of the survey, the TED question. Perhaps we could show it on the screen right now. The question is, who do you believe is best placed to provide an assessment, or who is the more credible source when it comes to the realistic assessment of the safety at the relevant destination? Please, only one answer. Is it the tour operator who is responsible for travelers? Destinations, because local organizations are more likely to know what's going on and what can actually be done. And the third one is, I don't trust either of the above. So now you have the opportunity to pick your choice.
Gut, der Computer.
Excellent. The computer has acted quickly. This is an interesting insight. I would have expected a more clear-cut picture, but turning to you now, who is most credible when it comes to communication, and who has to share the responsibility or shoulder responsibility when it comes to the situation? I mean, in terms of destinations, PR and marketing, could you say something about that? Well, I think both are really responsible. First of all, certainly the destination country, because people on the ground are knowledgeable. And in some countries in the past, the lingering impression was that when it comes to security or crisis management seemed to be completely unknown. If there's an attack, for example, or if there's another crisis, then there's a huge rush of speculative statements being put out on the social media, and the official channels remain silent. And what really needs to take place is we need to know exactly who is in charge, who is able to speak about what in an auditable way. We need to have a crisis management center, and in many countries that simply was non-existent. And my recommendation for every country is to make sure how you can do so. And I think Greek police went ahead with an excellent example, because they designated a person who was in charge for that communication in every situation. And if you, as a destination, don't do so, don't undertake this effort, then you shouldn't be surprised if tourists no longer flock to your offer. German tour operators in the last 5 years have learned a lot, and have improved their communication, have really added to their competences and staff. But on the other side of the equation, destination countries need to work on crisis communication, or in the case of a cataclysmic event, or in the case, for example, of Turkey or Tunisia, you need to develop a communication strategy rapidly in order to recover confidence and trust on the part of the clients. I mean, you could, for example, and in the case of Turkey and Tunisia, are beefing up their terrorism, anti-terrorism activities with the help of Germany, but they aren't communicating these activities. You need to communicate what you're doing in order to improve the situation. In such a situation, marketing and communication are the most important tools to remedy the situation. The more you've suffered, in inverted commas, in the past, the more you need good communication, because these images of terrorist attacks are the images that remain and linger in the minds of the audience, and you need to be able to countervail the effect of these images the whole year long with a year-long and cross-seasonal marketing strategy. You need it's not sufficient simply to put out nice images and then hope that people will just book the destination, but you need to be more proactive in that sense. You need to make sure that the social media area, the PR area, is continuously active. It's no use if you have a wonderful advert in the newspaper for your destination, but on the other page there are images of bloody corpses lying in the street. So you need to make sure that security is communicated. You need to have that as a clear USP. It has existed in the past, but the security criterion is increasingly important. You need to flank it with communication, PR, and social media measures. So you need to see it as an added value to the core business proposal. In addition to diversity, sun, sand, sea, hospitality, cuisine, in addition to hospitality, security is one of the core factors. But this also depends very much on the media situation, so it tends to fluctuate in terms of importance. The media, of course, tend to blow up the negative sides and the scandal, and when things calm down, then the TV teams pull up the stakes and move on. So at that point, you need to be proactive. Nobody's going to do that job for you. No tour operator is going to communicate on your behalf. So you, as a destination, you need to promote your country starting in January and running all through the year to December, bringing back normalcy or the normal day-to-day life into the living rooms across through the TV screens and promoting it to your clients. Showing, for example, those teams, football teams that set up their winter training camps in your destination, for example. That is something that can be promoted free of charge in the daily newsreels. But the rest of the normal life, if you will, day by day or daily life, has to be promoted actively. So you need to work as a PR expert, you need to work in the various areas and domains of communication, media platforms, etc. And as a tour operator, as a destination, you need to work together in order to raise that trust and re-establish the trust in the minds of the client. Well, I mean, military police, for example, with submachine guns on the beach, that's certainly not something that will enhance the feeling of safety and security. But is there other areas, for example, the area of air travel, that might set examples that can be emulated in order to promote that idea of safety and security? You just mentioned, for example, the football teams or clubs setting up their training camps in winter in certain destinations. That can be promoted also under the headline of or tagline of security. How can we go about it, learning from other sectors? Well, I mean, the most salient example is the air travel industry. If you look at Qatar Airways, Lufthansa, Etihad, or Emirates, if you book those airlines, you wish to have comfort and service, premium service, but you also want to know that they're safe, How often do their aircraft crash? And what do they do in terms of safety and security? And you need to inform people. And this information really depends on the security situation and the media situation. If the security situation is stable, then you can reduce that factor and you can show a 95% rosy picture. But those people who are afraid of air travel, you need to provide them with the adequate information. In the case of an air crash, of course, the security threat level will rise exponentially, and then you need to communicate, for example, the technical maintenance of your aircraft, the efforts that you're putting into that. And that is the same effort that destinations have to do. For example, Morocco, Tunisia, they need to communicate the situation, and not just on their website. If you search on the website, you need to, and if somebody is searching the website, you need to assume that they're already interested in the destination. So you need to reach out to the client. You need to reach out and not just expect them to simply access some information on the website, then that would solve the problem. You need to go into the shopping malls. You need to be present in the media. It's work. Active work, proactive work. Of course, you need to solve the security issues that might arise, and of course, you don't need thousands of black-clad, machine gun-toting men on the beach. That's not what's taking place. Most of those safety measures that are being taken are of a civilian nature and are hardly perceptive. They take place behind the screen, if you will. Behind the scenery. In the last couple of years in Turkey, we had one celebration after the other, opening new hotels, and usually communication was limited to inviting our journalists and friends to the opening. But in the year 2016, sea change took place. We were shocked ourselves because we ourselves live in the areas where the bombs go up. People who are affected by that don't just think about their job or their income, but about the safety of their family and their health. And that was something that really shocked us last year. Unfortunately, since October 2015, right up until New Year's Eve 2016, we had a total of 27 attacks with a rough number of almost 3,000 victims. So every 10 days, a large explosive device blew up somewhere. Those are images that someone like me, who is a well-seasoned traveler and has seen many places in the world, still needs to process. There were times and days where I was sitting at the table looking at the TV screen, and then suddenly these images erupted of casualties and dead people, and and my eyes welled up with tears. And I also spent sleepless nights. One of the saddest nights that I spent was just a couple of weeks, 2 months ago. That was that New Year's evening where I learned that so many people had been killed, and it was a place where I myself go very often to entertain friends. I'll try and keep it short. Tourist professionals the world over tend to communicate when things are well and rosy. A hotel opening, it's the announcement, the new year of the excellent new catalog of offers. But the true crisis in this kind of form, when it erupts, is something that was never witnessed before in Turkey. And in Turkey, we spoke with numerous experts as to what we should do, and opinions were extremely diverse. And then we went to Germany, and the experts told us not to communicate anything. How can you communicate that? On the one hand side, you have bombs are going up, and then the president, who was democratically elected in Turkey, is being portrayed in the media as a villain. So many experts said, don't try to do anything, because you can't win this one. Anything you say will be held against you. And therefore, some tour operators chose that access. I went about it in a completely different way. I communicated very transparently with all of my business partners and clients. I wrote to them that the situation is dire, but that I have to, pay salaries, that the hotels are continuing to be open. We're a country of 80 million citizens. We're not just a small Caribbean country where Studiosus can send 3,000 or 4,000 people. But we have 14 million guests every year, and we have millions of people who work in this field. 10 million people depend on that income. And when the very first guest appears, I have already an in tray full of invoices. So I can't just go around and say, well, sorry, I can't pay you because some bomb has gone up. And things have also become more expensive. That's on an aside completely to all the terror business and the bombs. We had expert companies that we're consulting that are setting up concepts. We also have security firms of global reputation, amongst other also a German company headquartered in Hamburg, TÜV Nord as well, that are establishing a concept for Antalya, a security concept that can be professionalized. There are wonderful PR companies that have reached out to us and want to help us because they are of the opinion that our approach has not been up to the task. And that's true, but of course if you don't have the experience, no amount of money in the world can really provide you with the right concept. The guests of Mr. Kupsch have a different kind of profile than the guests that come to Turkey. Mr. Kupsch and his dear father actually did a lot for Turkey, and I'm full of recognition for what they have achieved. But even in the best year, we're talking about 2,000 to 5,000 guests per annum. Turkey, that receives much in excess of 14 million guests. We're much more an FTI country. This is a product that something that I also regret sometimes is very much focused on families and children. We have the best family accommodations in Europe. To 70% hotels in Turkey are set up with a view to catering to the needs of a family. And the problem is that families are hesitant to book. And so they book at a very late stage or not at all. And those are new experiences that we're making. And I do believe that we have learned from the experience. I myself have learned a lot. And if I walk through the ITB and look at all of these stands, something that I've always enjoyed doing at the ITB, I look at things also with a much more critical eye. I see that there are countries, and I'm well familiar with their problems, the kind of political repression that exists in their countries. My perception of tourism has also been somewhat altered. And I tried to look back 40 years ago, and many of the things that we as tour and tourism professionals need to change with regards to that. We should have perhaps not built and expanded capacities as rapidly. The environmental damage that accompanied that. I think there are lots of lessons to be learned there. But there is a security factor that also works as a deterrent for tourists, not just in Germany, but also in other places. But there's also this political chasm that is opening up, this political antipathy. I think you've used that also. You've looked at that in your study. Perhaps that is also an aspect that needs to be factored in increasingly, or is it something that we can neglect completely or relegate completely? Well, it's always a snapshot, right? And I do believe that it might change from one week to the next. The media do play a salient role in this case, as you just mentioned, and it also always depends on who's speaking, and I think that as a function of that, things might change quite rapidly. There's also another point that I'd like to mention, which is there's a difference between what people say and what they actually do. Mr. Baraner, you just said that there's also a good price, there's a good cost-benefit relation that you have in Turkey. And for some people, the range of choices isn't as big, and therefore the price is also a salient factor when it comes to booking of travel. So above and beyond what people think and say, it is it comes down to hard facts such as the pricing. Of course, the time is moving quite rapidly. Mr. Baraner, we've heard what you said, and it's also very, very interesting because you do seem to see that Turkey is still very much a package tour destination, not for study travel, the more critical clients. Well, fortunately, the vast, the majority of offers is really seaside resorts. But okay, this is perhaps only indirectly linked to the current situation. Mr. Kupsch, what does the future hold in store? Will you promote certain destinations, shut out other destinations, or what kinds of shift can we expect from you? Well, I'd also like to speak about something else, and something that was somehow neglected in this debate. I mean, security is the first rank, performance is the second, but the third place is trust. That came across very clearly in your study. And if I look at this context, and if I look at the result of the last survey that we had here, well, I mean, for Christ's sakes, things couldn't really become more dire. 1/3 of the people present in this hall say that they didn't trust either the destination or the tour operator. And if you were to expand the audience to the entire ATB, I'm not quite sure what the result would be. But if we look at the hard facts, the little trust that exists in security measures and in a security concept, how do we, for heaven's sake, wish to convey this to our guests? This is not something that you can achieve overnight. This is something that requires a long-term effort. And I do believe that the entire sector made bad mistakes in the past, lost trust and confidence, and that is also reflected in these figures. Yeah, I was also quite surprised. You could also see it this way, that everybody is called upon to meet their responsibility and act. That would be a positive spin. Mr. Schiller, from a perspective of a large-scale tour operator, prospects for the future, changes in the business model, or a reestablishment of confidence in the destinations? Well, Mr. Zulauf mentioned quite a number of very, very good points. We need to be much more professional on the part of the destinations as well. Sometimes it's not just down to professionalism. Sometimes it's also down to certain mentalities that exist at the destinations. I believe too, and in some cases they shy away from transparency and they choose not to communicate. And sometimes we see that despite the best counseling, people in certain destinations still choose to go the other way. On the other hand, I do believe that we as tour operators need to be very, very flexible in planning. We need to be able to shift capacities almost instantly if the necessity or this requirement arises. But we also need to retain our cool or level-headedness. I believe, as was just mentioned, it is also down to the snapshot situation in the media. For a number of weeks, for example, we had Greece in the headlines, and that led to a situation where 2 years ago, demand for Greece dramatically collapsed. Nowadays, nobody's speaking anymore about that, even though the situation in Greece might not have really changed that fundamentally. In the last couple of weeks, at the beginning of the year, Mr. Trump was dominant in the headlines, and therefore Erdogan was slightly in the shadows, and demand for Turkey peaked up. I do believe that we are all well advised not to have knee-jerk reactions and to immediately question everything, because I think in the long run, it's much more important to ensure that destinations are aware that they need to earn a long-term trust and confidence. And for us as a tour operators, it's very important to focus on certain and stick to certain topics, and not to be driven by the supposed public opinion and then wildly shift capacities back and forth. And as soon as certain turmoil erupts, to act in panic. And I think very often we also see that there are sound economic reasons to do so. So we try to maintain our model. We try to live up to our corporate responsibility, not only vis-à-vis our clients, but also vis-à-vis our employees at the destinations and our staff members. And I am pretty sure that that holds true in the case of Studios as well. But that doesn't mean that we cannot, or that also means that we can be very transparent about our dealings. We know how to communicate with full transparency, and even if that means going against the current at some point, I think that on the whole and in the long run, that is a very positive thing. So this is your opportunity to make a strong, or put out a strong message, Mr. Baraner, perhaps, to present a strong opinion. And where are the perspectives here? As far as the tourism boards are concerned, I mean, it is the case that you need to focus on the destinations, and you need to put back your own priorities, perhaps. Nice images are insufficient. You need to be more proactive. It's not sufficient to have isolated PR campaigns. You need to be present the year over. And when it comes to the tourism sector, you need to maintain solidarity in good times and in bad times. If Turkey is not doing well, you need to have solidarity. And last year, for example, the event regarding Turkey, the trade fair regarding Turkey was canceled simply because people were afraid to go there. And, to be a fair weather friend is not enough. You need to stand shoulder to shoulder with your friends also when the going is rough. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the question whether destinations are going to be reshuffled for the future, I think that is a question that we will have to continue to ask. I think what we see and what we have gained an insight from this debate shows that things are happening, the media are playing a salient role, but also this sort of diffuse or vague fear of a threat that can be very rational as an effect. I wish you all a very, very successful ITB and safe travels. Thank you.